Let's get started. This In Focus session is being hosted in conjunction with two other, with Seeing Through Photographs, which is the course that I know best, but also in conjunction with two other of MoMA's online courses. One is, we'll get to the other ones in a minute. But I'm Sarah Meister. I have been the lead instructor of Seeing Through Photographs, but joining me is our longtime friend, my dear, dear colleague, and now the incoming lead instructor for Seeing Through Photographs, Lucy Gallun. So Lucy, would you say hi?
Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if I can call myself the lead instructor. We are now co-instructing because happily Sarah will not leave the course. Anyone that has just joined or will be joining, we get to still see Sarah, and we're going to continue to see her for a little while longer. This is not the last time she's joining us on the course. But yes, I'm Lucy. I have happily had the opportunity to join you in some conversations recently. I curated an online show, Companion Pieces, New Photography 2020, and we had some really nice conversations recently with Dion Lee and Zora Murph and Irina Rozovsky, whose work were all featured in that show. So that was lovely to see you recently then. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversations in this way and other ways and exploring the course with you all to come.
Great. Well, everyone is very lucky to have you become even more involved with Seeing Through Photographs. So, but we are also joined today by one of the instructors of the course, What is Contemporary Art? Sean Anderson, who is also, I don't know how you do it, Sean, but also one of the instructors for MoMA's newest online course that was just launched last week in conjunction with the major exhibition that Sean organized. Again, I don't know how you did it, Reimagining Blackness and Architecture. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank
Hi,
you,
Sean.
Lucy. We're all just trying to emulate you, Sarah. So, come on. So it's a great pleasure always to join other courses in whatever form that might take. And we're looking forward, of course, to have future office hours, not only in What is Contemporary Art, but as Sarah said, our newest course, Reimagining Blackness and Architecture. My name is Sean Anderson, and I'm an associate curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA. And I'm so happy to join the world, it seems, today. I love it. And so just a little bit of a plug. So on Saturday, almost a week ago, we opened an exhibition that my co-curator, Mabel O. Wilson, and I organized entitled Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, which features the work of 11 architects, artists, and designers who all are seeking to transform not only the ideas around which we imagine the built environment today, but also who seek to transform the spaces of 10 American cities. And at the same time that the exhibition opened, we also launched, thanks to the extraordinary Herculean efforts of Sarah Bunsen, Kelly Cannon, and Arlette Hernandez, our course on Coursera called Reimagining Blackness and Architecture. And it takes inspiration from the exhibition, and it includes numerous videos about the projects featured in the exhibition and the producers that made them. And you will also hear from scholars, artists, curators, thinkers, who are all reimagining those techniques, those questions, those spaces that are in some ways very much a part of and indebted to legacies of colonialism, the Middle Passage, anti-Black racism, and so forth. We ask the question, how does space influence the ways in which we live and see each other, perhaps more importantly? And how has anti-Black racism been designed into these spaces? And how do Black and Brown communities begin to respond to and redefine these spaces? So that is the very long plug.
Not really.
And I'm so happy to be here to talk with Sarah and Lucy today about Robert Frank and this extraordinary image. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I do hope we talk more about the exhibition and your course. But the main focus of today is Robert Frank's New Orleans. So we will do it through the lens of this singularly important photograph. Lucy wrote this book, which actually I wish I could hold up right now. I don't even have a copy yet, but I've pre-ordered mine. I'm waiting for it. Lucy has one. Hold it up so we can see it.
Yes, I was going to say, literally, this is a brand new book. It's in fact my first time talking about the book. I realized this morning, I was like, this is my first occasion to talk about the book. And I also heard from publications that they are actually just now sending the advanced copies to those folks who helped out with images and everything. So literally, this is a sneak peek to this book.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
we like giving our Coursera people sneak peeks. So this is happening today. So Lucy is going to talk about this book. You might remember that in the past, we've talked about one that I wrote about Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, but this is a part of a trio of new titles about photographs for the one-on-one series. Lucy writing about Robert Frank, a colleague named Shamoun Zamir from NYU Abu Dhabi, who writes about Helen Levitt's photographs, and Gwen Allen, a distinguished scholar who is writing about one of Cindy Sherman's centerfold pictures. So there are great new additions to the one-on-one series, and the Frank is one of them. And Lucy, maybe you'll give us a little bit of an introduction here. So Sean and I will, close our little, and also, yeah, exactly. Can we hear about Robert Frank? You're right, enough time. Someone else asked about our backgrounds, and we'll get to that in the Q&A. So without further ado, it's 1:42. Let's talk about Robert Frank. Lucy, take it away.
Sure. So yes, as Sarah mentioned, I had this recent extraordinary opportunity to write about this picture, and actually the full picture is there on your screen, Trolley, New Orleans by Robert Frank. And it was a picture that was captured on November 11th, 1955. And as Sarah mentioned, this is a new book in the MoMA's one-on-one series, which is a sustained meditation on a single work from MoMA's collection. So like Sarah's book on Migrant Mother, that was the first book in the one-on-one series about a photograph in the collection. Others have been about paintings or sculptures, objects. This one is on this one picture, which is of course part of Robert Frank's wider project, The Americans. I wrote this book very recently, but largely it was written during the first weeks of the pandemic. It was finished in May. It was very difficult to write the book then. My children were asleep. I was writing it at night. And then it was edited this past summer. And it was really interesting at that moment to be writing about this picture that was completely of its time, as Peter Galassi, who the former chief curator of the Department of Photography at MoMA, has said about the picture. It was, quote, marked by the stamp of another time. So it's completely a picture of its moment, but at the same time, it's absolutely urgent in what it conveys today about our lives today and how they've been shaped through race. And so I'm really thrilled that we're able to talk about the picture through this lens today with Sean and Sarah. Many of you that are here joining us today are likely very familiar with Robert Frank, the Swiss-born photographer who moved to New York in 1946 at age 22. After arriving here in New York, he worked with Alexei Brodovich, the influential art director at Harper's Bazaar. Actually, we could go to the next slide. And his work was also noted by Edward Steichen, the photographer and director of photography here at MoMA at that time. Steichen included Frank in his first show at MoMA. Frank's first show at MoMA was in 1950, so quite early after he had moved here. Then he had several photographs in the 1955 landmark exhibition Family of Man, curated by Steichen. And then in 1962, he had a two-person show at MoMA with Harry Callahan. And here you see an image of a group of pictures from that show from Frank's landmark project, The Americans, including this picture, Trolley, New Orleans, on the top right. And so let's give a very short introduction to the picture itself. But I just want to say there's a lot of context, history, many compelling anecdotes in the book itself. And we also really want to have a chance to talk together about some of the ideas together with you all. So I will briefly introduce you to the picture. The next slide, we can look closely together. The first thing I think many of us will notice is the order of the passengers in the streetcar mirrors the unjust social order in the world around them. So at left, at the front of the trolley appears to be a white man, partially obscured by the reflections in the glass. Then behind him is a white woman, then two white children, then a black man, and then a black woman. And there are, interestingly, the window bars are really separating each individual as they look out at the world around them from the window. There's also this interesting way that is almost like a film strip at the middle of the picture, and then above it are these swirling reflections that take a different cast from the row below. In a letter home to his parents written in late 1955, it's dated winter 1955, so keep in mind he took this picture in November 1955, Frank wrote, "America is an interesting country, but there is a lot here that I do not like and that I would never accept. I'm trying to show this in my photos." The little girl that's right at the center of the photo has her hand, and you might not notice at first, but she has her hand raised up a little higher than the seat behind her. And that's because her hand is resting on a race screen in that streetcar. So if you go to the next slide, there's a picture of an interior of a New Orleans streetcar from the early 1950s. And here you can see clearly the race screens, which could have been picked up and moved by passengers on as they entered the trolley. There were holes in each of the seats that the screen could be moved onto physically themselves. So the fact that this young girl has her hand there just shows how complicit every member of society was in this construction and its lived experience. The next picture, the next slide, shows Frank's contact sheet from this part of his road trip, which I'll talk a little bit about. He was in New Orleans, and you can see, hopefully maybe you can see on your left, depending on the size of your screen, there's a row here of frames that is outlined in red, the second from the top, and then all the way on the right is Trolley there. While he was in New Orleans here on Canal Street, there's another picture in this group that he ended up also including in The Americans, the next picture in the book, of Canal Street. So this trolley is going down Canal Street, and it's a really different kind of picture of all of the people in that milieu moving past one another. But interestingly, maybe they're also in their own worlds, looking past one another while also circling together. One other thing I wanted to note about this is that there's kind of a famous quote from a popular photography review of 1960 when the book came out. It was really critically noted at the time, and people had strong opinions on it. And one of the reviewers in popular photography said that The Americans was flawed by meaningless blur, grain, muddy exposure, drunken horizons, and general sloppiness. That's often quoted. And from the contact sheet, you could see a lot of that blur and sloppiness, but yet this picture, Trolley, displays none of those characteristics. It is absolutely clear, frontal, so that each person is really in their own space looking out at us. And there are only two pictures on the contact sheet, two exposures of the trolley. And perhaps this one happened to be made when the trolley was stopped still, not moving for one moment, and then the next one, it moved on by. If we go to the next slide, we see here the book itself where people would have experienced these photographs. Frank anticipated that it would be first published in Europe. He applied for a Guggenheim Fellowship, through which he was able to take this extended road trip with many legs across the United States. And even in that application, he anticipated there were two outlets that he could publish the work in Europe. And indeed it was published by Delpierre in Paris in 1958 in November. And there was the Americans did not appear on the cover. There's this illustration by Saul Steinberg on the cover. And then the following year, almost a year later, at the end of 1958, although it wasn't released until at the end of 1959, although it wasn't released until January 1960, distributed, Grove Press published The Americans here in the US. Also in that application, and thinking about the wider project of The Americans, he wrote that he had been trying to make a picture that said it all, that was a masterpiece, a picture that really said it all. But by the mid-50s, he was reflecting that there had to be a more sustained form of visual expression, was how he put it. There had to be more pictures that would sustain a vision or an idea of something. I couldn't just depend on one singular photograph anymore. And so that's what he was doing when he was applying for this project to take a broad view of America, this multi-leg road trip that he ended up taking. Interestingly, Trolley ended up on the cover, and one might say that it does say it all, or says a lot about America in one way. We could talk about that later, maybe. He said about the decision to feature Trolley on the cover, he hadn't felt that the Steinberg illustration really spoke to the contents of the book. He was very close with the Beats at the time, and actually on the back cover of The Americans, the US version, there is an illustration by Alfred Leslie, which was one of his recommendations. But he said about Trolley, it seemed to be the right picture. It expressed a lot of what I'd seen on the trip, a treatment of Black people, and I felt it really reflected some of the strongest moments. When I experienced for the first time segregation, it was important to me that it could be expressed like this. Interestingly, by the time the book was released, there was no longer segregated trolleys in New Orleans. So in May 1958, there was a court order by Judge Skelly Wright, who was the same judge actually who was instrumental in desegregating schools and sending Ruby Bridges to the all-white elementary school in New Orleans. But overnight, the race screens were removed, the holes were filled in the spring of 1958. So by the time this image was circulating on the cover of the book, New Orleans streetcars were no longer segregated. But of course, that did not make the picture any less meaningful in what it said about America. And if we go to the next image, there are a couple of examples here of other photographs from The Americans, which ended up having 83 photographs in the book out of many, many hundreds of pictures that were made over 2 years on the road trip. But these two pictures, one of them on the right was mentioned quite frequently in press when the book was released. Interestingly, even though Trolley was on the cover of the US version, reviews barely mention Trolley, but do often mention this picture, Charlotte. And then on the left, San Francisco, and is a picture that Robert Frank himself felt was one of his favorites in the book. He often cited it as his favorite in the book. And it's a picture that's made at the moment that the subjects that are pictured there realize that they are being watched. And the wonderful scholar, Maurice Berger, who sadly passed this past year, has written on this picture and has pointed out that the photographer of the picture, Frank, is, like the viewer, not a neutral observer, but, quote, rather a surrogate for the intimidating whiteness that shadowed the lives of Black Americans, no matter how liberal their environment. So pointing out that this picture was made in San Francisco, and Frank himself pointed out that the part of the trip where he was in Charlotte, he visited the Carolinas and Georgia before he went to New Orleans. That was his first time in the South. That he said that was the first time I really saw segregation. But in fact, this intimidating whiteness would follow folks throughout the country, throughout the United States. If we go to the next slide, there was a moment on that trip in Arkansas just before Frank went down to New Orleans. So it was actually a couple of days before his birthday in November. And he was pulled over while driving in Arkansas and questioned by the Arkansas State Police. And they asked him about what he was doing. He was a photographer on a Guggenheim Fellowship. They noted the name Guggenheim. They noted his foreign accent. He was held and questioned at length. And it was a very meaningful experience for him that he reflected on several times later. He had already felt himself as other, even in the Guggenheim application. He pointed out he was a European seeing America. So he already felt that position, but this moment of experiencing the hardship of being from the outside was something that he really noted. And then it came about, this page on the left is from his artist's book, an amazing book, The Lines of My Hand, where he reflects on this moment. These are some pictures that he made outside the high school in Arkansas and the feeling that he felt there directed at him and directed at members of society. And on the right is actually a picture that he had made before the road trip, but that did end up in the Americans, called En route to New York, from New York to Washington. And this picture was actually made on commission for Fortune magazine. Walker Evans, the photographer who Frank was very close with, was the photo editor at Fortune. And this issue came out in November 1955. So the picture was made in the winter of 1954-55. It came out in November 1955, and he happened to have the new issue there in his car. And he felt later that this issue of Fortune legitimized him maybe to the state police that were searching the car and questioning him. But interestingly, it still takes that view of an outsider kind of looking in on the whispered conversations on this congressional car of the important men traveling between New York and Washington, and what was his position there, and this other form of transportation. Maybe we'll come back to this later. Just quickly, before we start talking all together, the next slide. The book really talks, this book, my book, really talks a lot about the context of the image and how that context has continued to reverberate. So the picture appeared here in 1964 in this book published by Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with Simon & Schuster, SNCC. The Movement, documentary of a struggle for equality, and circulated among civil rights photographs. On the cover of The Movement is a picture by Danny Lyon, the photographer for SNCC, and this really jolting image. But interestingly, Frank's picture works in a slightly different way, and also a different way from the image that it's paired with on the page spread here in the book, which is a United Press photo from Detroit. It isn't an image of violence against Black people in the South by police, by, with dogs. So it isn't a spectacularizing image, but rather it's an image of everyday systemic racism. So there's a slightly different quality, and maybe we can talk more about that in a little bit later. If we go to the next slide, before we jump off, there's also a lot of context about other imagery of segregation and how this picture fits into that history. And so just here, we see Jacob Lawrence's painting of the segregated bus from 1941, even also in New Orleans at a moment when Jacob Lawrence had moved to New Orleans. And this is kind of the moment he's thinking about why folks might have made that great migration. If you know Jacob Lawrence's series, The Great Migration to Other Cities, this is the experience that they were having in the Jim Crow South in the 40s. Or also here, Gordon Parks' picture of the colored waiting room at a Nashville bus station, which was part of a photo essay that appeared in Life magazine on segregation as a topic. So let's stop there so we can talk. But I think also this is a great segue to Sean, who I think was going to talk about Nashville specifically as well. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I think let's let Sean share a little bit about sort of what he sees in this picture and how it fits into his thinking. And then there are so many great questions that have come in through the chat. I promise we will try to make time for all of those too. But first, one of the things that I love about these in focus sessions is that they really privilege the idea of like different people, different perspectives, different practices, what those bring to the same object or same artist. So Sean, what do you see?
So I will be very, very brief because I think we should return to Frank more specifically. But the segue here is about Nashville. And more broadly, what I see in this image is not only division, but an idea that the United States in particular is built and designed around the separation of peoples. So we might say that anti-Black racism was designed. It was designed through maps, it was designed through laws, it was designed through the imposition of new spatial codes that defined and actually created these almost arbitrary separations of peoples. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to very briefly just articulate this connection also to the trolley in and of itself. This work that you see on the right side of the screen from our exhibition is built and designed around an abstracted idea of a trolley in Nashville, Tennessee. In Nashville, in the 1950s, a group of African-American businessmen created a second trolley system that was, in fact, only for the Black communities, because trolleys in Nashville, as well as elsewhere in American cities, were often only for the predominantly white communities. So here in Nashville, we had a trolley system that bypassed literally the white communities and located the stops in Black communities. So if we go back one image very quickly. So this is a work by Mario Gooden, who began to analyze not only the spaces that were sites for many of the sit-ins and the protests that were happening throughout Nashville, as well as elsewhere during the civil rights movement, but an idea that notions of mobility, of moving in and through space, was not only a privileged place to be, a privileged location, but this idea of mobility of the African-American and diasporic peoples through American cities created a frame for being able to transgress or even bypass the arbitrary boundaries and spaces of segregation for them. So my take on all of these questions that I've been seeing, these fantastic questions that I've been seeing, is that how do we reconcile a history of the American city, but also global cities, in as much as race becomes the determinant by where and how we live today. And the afterlives of anti-Black racism is ever present in America today. One need only look at COVID infection rates and vaccination rates to understand that the lack of infrastructure, the lack of the ability for cities and states to adequately address Black communities of color is longstanding and needs to change.
Sean, actually, there was one question that came in asking about how these ideas around design also relate to keeping people with disabilities excluded. And I was wondering if while we're still thinking about Mario Gooden in your exhibition specifically, could you speak to that?
Sure. What someone kindly has put up Mario's quote here, but we could, in effect, not replace, but add notions of mobility and accessibility to this quote or to our ideas of the built environment more broadly. Accessibility is a fairly recent, if not relatively new idea, especially in the American city. So the idea of a wheelchair ramp, for instance, or the accoutrements that are required in elevators and bathrooms and so forth. Accessibility is not just about accessing space. It's about allowing for every individual, no matter their race, but also their ability to function as normal and complete citizens in the American context. These were created through discriminatory laws that then are trying in a way today to be reversed, if not re-engineered. So any ramp that you see in front of a building or to a door is one way in which that architects, engineers, and developers are trying to address this long-standing kind of pushing away of separating people more broadly.
Yeah, I thought that was a great question to sort of expand how we're thinking about these things, because these are human issues that this is one of the things that we want to bring forward, is like this doesn't just matter in 1955. This is why we're still talking about it today. And your exhibition and your course are like just two very meaningful ways of expanding our thinking. So I'm gonna do my best to bring in some of the questions. Just as a reminder, if you think of the chat as something that's between the participants, especially if you click panelists and attendees, that's wonderful. There was a nice little chat about Magnum and whether Frank was or should have been a Magnum photographer. But if you save the Q&A for questions that you want for Sean and Lucy and me to address, you can also upvote other questions that you think someone else may have asked that you want to make sure we get to. But I have picked, with the help of Sarah and Arlette, who are behind the scenes helping me grasp things from the chat, about the title, Lucy,
Yep.
and the decision. So
one.
there was an interesting question first about that funny Saul Steinberg drawing on the French edition, which I agree, I've always thought was such a strange.
As much as we love Saul Steinberg.
Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with Saul Steinberg.
Yes, I know, Sarah.
Lucy knows how obsessed I am with Saul Steinberg. In fact, maybe Sarah Bodenson can look it up and put it in the chat, because one of my acquisitions that I really, really loved was a Saul Steinberg photograph with a similar drawing on it. But that's not the point today.
Arlette, maybe you could go back to those book covers.
Oh yeah, thank
if
you.
you'd like. After I finished talking, I was looking at the chat and I saw that same question. And indeed, there are different reasons.
Two things to address. One is the covers but also how would it change if the book were called Americans instead of Americans? So thank you.
Totally. So it's interesting. I just want to give a shout out to colleague Sarah Greeno of the National Gallery, who has done so much amazing research and work on Robert Frank and the Americans. But one thing that I first noted in her research was about how when Les Américains, the French version, was published, it's actually part of a series. And I didn't talk much about it, but there are others that came in the series called The Germans or The Arabs. So something to note, because that helps put it in context. And once it was published as The Americans, it might have been an easy bridge over to the English, The Americans. But also there were other maquettes that Frank had made, and actually some of them just said America. One said America, America, before it was sent off. So in versions that he put together, it maybe wasn't The Americans. But also in the French version, you'll see the bottom picture where that shows Trolley inside the book. You'll see there's a lot of text on the left. And that's because that book has collected texts about America in it. So Frank's pictures are all of the illustrations in the book, and it's the 83 pictures that are in the book. But on the back cover, you see there's a bunch of red type there. Those are people's names of the various cultural producers or politicians, etc., who have texts about the experience of living in America are there. And actually, they kind of, match up in a random but interesting way with the pictures. So there might be something about race next to the Charlotte picture that we saw, for example, but not necessarily. Whereas in the Americans, it is a picture of Frank's photographs with just his title, the place next to it.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yes.
And actually, here's another great question, which brings us back to someone submitted in advance a question about whether this is a self-portrait, whether you can see Frank in it. And that connects to another recent question that came in that was this. I'm going to quote it because it's beautifully phrased. Do you have thoughts about the 5 abstract expressionist panels above the trolley windows? And I actually, so Lucy, I'm going to take it away too, but can we go to the main picture to be able to look at those abstract expressions?
Wonderful. Yeah. So just above the band of individually framed people are the swirls of reflected light and dark. And I loved that question too about, is this a self-portrait? Because yeah, likely one of those silhouettes there, if you look at it up close, they're people, but with the swirls of the undulating glass around them. So I can only imagine that one of those is Frank amongst other people that are standing on the sidewalk. But just the question itself of it being a self-portrait about your own position in the world as the photographer is so right on. And also Frank himself talked so much about, it was his view of America, one person's view coming from Europe, my view that was in the application, then reflecting back, he, kept saying, it's also a personal view. So even as this picture says so much to us about a particular moment in time in America, and also everything that shaped it and that still continues to shape our lives and people's lives here, the last picture in the Americans, for example, was Frank's own picture looking in his car at his wife, Mary, and child Pablo. You see his daughter, Andrea, was there, which is not visible, but like in the car window. And that last picture is also looking back at the window, but it's a personal view. So for sure, his position is so important to the picture, even as it says so many more wider things about our lives.
I wonder, Lucy, if I may, if the young boy who is at the center, more or less the physical center of the image itself, becomes the kind of reflection of the photographer himself at a different age, at one in which the learning perhaps of division, of segregation, is not necessarily one that is being taught, it's just being experienced. As it were. And just to extend the question around self-portrait, it's a curious phenomenon that perhaps both the young boy and the woman at his right also perhaps is looking at him, but that view is implicating to a certain degree, and then kind of by design, if you will, that the blurriness of the city and the context above is also part of that portraiture.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, just
go ahead. No, just the eye contact.
I see these these 5 little vignettes that are absolutely, to me, they offer it's almost like you're presented with a choice, and it's each one, with whom do you identify in this? And I think in the, and of course he couldn't control who happened to be sitting there, but in terms of the range of ages and skin colors, and it's just so precise and explicit in offering that choice. And then the counterpoint, both visually and actually, of what you see up above, it then, it just underscores the way photographs operate on these 2 levels about which Frank was so keenly attuned. but maybe actually we're talking about that specificity through those windows. Lucy, maybe that W, do we want to go there? This wasn't.
Yes, I saw there's also a question about it.
Now that we're looking at it again.
Yes, let's look closely at a window. There's a question about, someone asked, what's that symbol in the picture? And someone already answered. I think it's an all
symbol. Yes.
So you guys are seeing it. We're going to look closely at the woman, the white woman. If you see just in front of her, we can see all the way through the trolley. So through both windows, and on the other side is Walgreens on Canal Street. And so indeed, this locates the trolley exactly where it was on Canal Street in front of the Walgreens. And actually that particular site is so meaningful. And I think we have a slide about it. Thank you. There it is. So, you know, if we think about the trolley as a symbol of segregation or other forms of transportation, the bus in America, the lunch counter was obviously another important site. And Frank included a lunch counter, actually more than one lunch counter picture, as this really iconic image of America and of American culture. So that's Frank's picture in Detroit on the left. On the right, this is a news picture from a sit-in at the Woolworths on Canal Street. So actually both that Walgreens and the Woolworths were sites of sit-ins in the years following Trolley. So even, again, as we said, even though there was a court order where the streetcars became desegregated, and I think actually someone was pointing out, that didn't mean that segregation was just ended. The fight was ongoing and the experiences were ongoing. So this particular image is elsewhere on Canal Street, but anecdotes in the news about sit-ins taking place at that particular Walgreens. So I love that overlapping layer and the significance of seeing that Walgreens logo and locating these various sites on top of one another.
Maybe Sean, you could connect this back one more time to your exhibition, because I think this idea of like structures, you know, as you said so beautifully before, how anti-Black racism was designed physically in cities. So
absolutely. I think, you know, if we take the scale of the city and the mapping of the city, in particular, at the turn of the 20th century, there were townships called the All Black Towns. These were towns that were founded and built by Black communities, often freed slaves that were not given space in the South, and they moved westward, mainly to Oklahoma and to other states around it. But to imagine that the city as defined by boundaries, both invisible and physical, and that we take, for instance, the 1938 Home Loan Corporation maps, which are otherwise known as the redlining maps, that valued land, valued spaces in every American city by virtue of who lived there. And that then further defined actually, the spaces in which people could be together. So the lunch counter, the sit-ins at lunch counters were not only a refusal to acknowledge these laws, these Jim Crow laws, but also a refusal of the very boundaries that had been designed and determined by law to keep people out of these public spaces. So I feel like there is a kind of an exquisite but violent tension between who is defined as public, who and where is the public in these spaces. But we also are seeing in these images in particular, that refusal, that standing up for being allowed to not only occupy public space, but to be seen in public space.
yeah. So there have been a handful of other interesting questions about the legacy, the impact of this work on Gary Winogrand, on Richard Avedon, and then more broadly on contemporary practices and thinking. Lucy, I don't know if you feel up for tackling that. You do get at it in the book, so I feel like in whatever way you want to think about, obviously we're still talking about this picture today, but I think several of these questions have come in not just from a curatorial perspective, but like what has been the influence on subsequent generations of artists?
Yeah, one thing that came up, and this is just part of the answer, or one answer to that, is about the subject matter. I noticed someone said, they remembered reading that Frank said this was a luck shot, and that the contact sheet really like shows you, wow, it stopped still and he got this amazing shot straight on. And others, when I've talked to folks about the picture and looked at other pictures of streetcars in New Orleans, actually, and actually we have a picture, and maybe we could go 2 more slides after this next one. Yeah, so this is a picture by Lee Friedlander made in New Orleans in 1959. So just after the streetcars were desegregated. A colleague put this in a show at the New Orleans Museum of Art of Lee Friedlander's pictures in New Orleans. I don't think it had been necessarily printed at the time, so not a well-known picture. But it's a very different picture from Frank's, and mainly a big difference is that the trolley isn't desegregated. But in talking to Lee about it, he also happened to say, in New Orleans, everyone would take a picture of a streetcar. It's just like a picture of New Orleans. And actually, another thing folks have noted about Frank's trip in general is that he took pictures of like symbols of a place. So, in Miami, he might have taken pictures of Art Deco hotels, or, in another place, he might have taken pictures of the open road or things like that. Like, he did tend to like capture certain attributes about different places through these symbols of them. And it's interesting to think about the fact that like the streetcar itself might have been a ubiquitous symbol of New Orleans for so many people that would go there. Like you almost couldn't go to New Orleans and not take a streetcar photo. So also Danny Lyon took one after Frank. But at the same time, of course, they were all aware of Frank's picture and so influenced by his work and this picture. So there's an interesting overlap of how a picture itself can become so iconic and meaningful to us. As this one, it appeared on a cover of a book. It reverberated in so many ways. And at the same time, it is such an everyday picture of a common thing in New Orleans and also everyday life. So perhaps that speaks to that question a little bit.
I think it definitely does. Sorry, I was trying to give my call here. Ready? I'm going to put in, with apologies for the lack of formality, this is the Steinberg picture that I was talking about. So sorry, I was trying to respond in the chat to 2 things at once, which is I can only do one thing at once. So there have been a few sort of technical and practical questions that I want to cover, a little bit following up on Lucy's beautiful response to the question of was it a lucky shot? Or someone else asked, is this if this is a chance, the chance encounter question, hold on, I'm going to read it because it was can't a photograph just capture a moment in time? There's lots of reading into this wonderfully composed photograph. This is interesting, but wasn't this just a chance encounter of a reflection of real life? And then the person concludes, but it is fun to discuss it. And I would say, yes, both and. In other words, one of the things that's so amazing about photography is that luck factors into it. You can have a chance encounter that then has enduring meaning, significance, relevance, and it can be both of those things. Just like you can answer technical questions and find those also interesting, so some of the technical questions were, I think, was he using a 50 millimeter lens? I have no idea. Anyone guesses? I mean, probably it would be my first guess, but Lucy, do you have any idea? It's definitely a 35 millimeter handheld camera.
Yes.
From the negative.
Right.
The lens.
And he did use a different camera, just as a historical thing. Before he came to New York, he had been using a different camera, and then actually was encouraged to move to the 35 millimeter Leica, and So this period of the Americans came after that shift, and this kind of snapshot moment came after that turn to the Leica. But one thing just to say about this book, just to mention, is that it's not so much a technical object book. Some of the books in the one-on-one are like a history of a particular thing and how it was made and traveled, and
Right.
and you could do that about the photo.
Sorry, Lucy, you're just
Yeah.
talking about your one-on-one book.
Yes,
about
this one-on-one book. It's more of a cultural history and a way. My book, I ended up writing something more about the way the image circulated as an image, and not as much about the technical aspects and then the print itself and the life of that print. But actually, other books in this series at MoMA, and in a way, your Lang book does talk about that, the particularness of some photographs as an object. And so,
yeah,
just
I
thing
I would actually say my book ended up being really the precursor to doing Dorothea Lange words and pictures, because it was about how it circulated with all of these different words that were true and false and accurate and inaccurate. And so in a different way, it was about circulation, including. So anyway, this is that, yes, I think the nice thing about the one-on-one books is that we're encouraged as authors to kind of pursue the angle that feels most interesting and relevant to us, and hope that in the process, we're writing something that's of interest to a broader public. So someone else asked an interesting question that we've discussed, how Frank influenced others, but do you see Frank's book and project inspired by Walker Evans' American Photographs, which is certainly, Lucy, you addressed this beautifully in the book. Maybe do you mind if I'm calling on you again? Because
not at all, although I know you could also answer the questions. And we could both talk about it. But yes, certainly, Frank was very influenced by Walker Evans. I showed the one picture from the congressional in the slides, but Walker Evans' own subway pictures wouldn't have been published yet at that time. Here they are. But that was a body of work. And then the book itself, the size, the scope, the number of images, certainly. And actually Todd Papageorge has written a book about the relationship between those two books.
Right, and I think on a very important like mentorship level, in other words, drawing connections, that Walker Evans wrote a letter supporting Robert Frank's application for the Guggenheim Fellowship that then enabled this project to happen. So there is not only an artistic legacy and attentiveness between them, but actually a wonderful gesture of personal and professional support. I think that is worth.
I'll jump in very quickly, because there were a number of questions also around the relationship of Kerouac as having written the intro to the American version. And I'm thinking of that realm of literature in which movement in the landscape in the city was one of imagination and expansion, in as much as critique of what was happening in America. So if you don't mind, Lucy, I was wondering if you could just say something about Kerouac, because I'm very curious as well.
Yes. So Frank wanted Kerouac's introduction to be the only text in the book. And so it appears at the beginning, and then, like we talked about, there aren't these texts corresponding to the photographs in the American version. And Frank had a very close relationship with Kerouac and the beats that he went on to explore in film. I know there's been some other questions about his turn to film, yes, so he was working with them. I also like the thinking about this question, though, Sean, in conversation about this mobility and exploration of the open road. And the privilege of doing so. You know, as I said, Frank acknowledged his own specific position as a Jew from Europe and his own subjective position on the road. But also he was very much a part of this group of the Beats that were taking advantage of that possibility in ways that others could not. Yeah.
So to my distress, it's 2:30, and I thought, so I know, I can't believe it.
There's so many questions.
What?
Honestly, I don't think I've ever had a seeing through photographs or in focus session that's gone so quickly. But there was, I think, instead of just ending it right here, what I'd love to do is one person asked, and this can kind of be the closing remarks about our backgrounds. Sort of how did we each get here to where we're thinking about this picture? So maybe we'll let people say goodbye and thank you. But as people are saying goodbye, maybe we just say a little bit about how each of us, our education, or how each of us got to this point today. Do you want me to go first?
First.
Fine, I'll go first. So, it's a bittersweet moment for me because I am ending a very long time as working at MoMA. I started photography as a photographer in high school and in middle school. I decided in college to switch over to study photography as a discipline within art history. And I was actually hired straight out of college to work as an intern in the Department of Photography at MoMA. So my education has been through the museum. All of my professional experience has been informed through learning through the museum's collection, really, and the brilliant colleagues that I feel so fortunate to have worked with, including and especially Lucy and Sean. It's in May, I will leave MoMA to become the executive director of Aperture, which is a foundation that also engages very deeply with photography, and that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
I can go next.
I have end on me.
Yes, we can. That's a great ending.
Let Sean go next. You're going to
Okay.
go last because this is going to be your baby going forward.
So,
go ahead, Sean.
Oh, well, okay. Exactly, Lucy and Sarah. So I am a practicing architect. I worked around the world in places like Afghanistan, Australia, Italy, India, Sri Lanka, Dubai. I also taught architecture in all of those places, but I have a PhD in African art, and I have spent a great deal of time in all of the sectors, most of the sectors of the African continent. And so my interest, not only in photography, but also thinking about spaces around the world, is always shaped by being in those spaces around the world. And it's a great privilege to be also always working with these extraordinary people like Sarah and Lucy.
Likewise to that, I feel so fortunate to have learned from both of you and worked alongside you. Sorry if you can hear that ding on my computer. But I have worked at MoMA now for 10.5 years, nowhere near as long as Sarah, but a good chunk of time, and have learned also along the way. Prior to working at MoMA, I did go to graduate school and focused on photography, but with contemporary art. I'm from Philadelphia and had worked prior to MoMA at a contemporary art museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and worked really closely with artists, the Whitney Independent Study Program, and I studied urban studies as well as art history while I was in school. And so certainly had more of a working with working artists, of which Frank was one until recently, I should say. Though this picture was made in 1955, yeah, only recently passed, and is a
You want to continue to
artist.
honor
And
will not be the last time we talk about Robert Frank, for sure.
Exactly.
Lucy, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you get
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's been wonderful to work very closely with both Sean and Sarah, but Sarah in the Department of Photography. And as we said, this is not like a sudden shift. We are working together over the next months, and obviously continuing forever. We'll be working together, just for two different
No,
institutions.
Seeing Through Photographs is dear to my heart to ever abandon. So it's the same thing with MoMA and all of you. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. It seems like from the chat you did. And until the next time, stay tuned. We'll be in touch very soon.
Great to see you all.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Bye.
Lucy and Sarah, for having me.
Oh, thank you, Sean.